Welcome to our program. My name is Hoda Mahmoudi, and I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace. We are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland in College Park. Just a reminder to everyone that today's program is being recorded. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Kate Seaman, who is the Assistant Director for the Bahá'í Chair, for her assistance in organizing today's program. And of course, it is my distinct pleasure to welcome our distinguished speaker today, Professor Ingrid Robans. Her cutting-edge work on social and political ethics examines the gap between what societies say is important and what they actually do. She seeks to unite the probable with the possible and looks to connect not just theory, but practice that leads to real results. In an era of too much, of divergent, drastic change, of emergency, how do we prepare? How do we organize ourselves to seek better solutions? Dr. Robans' research helps us understand how limits call for the inclusion of a broader majority. Such limits actually point to new freedoms by contrasting the worst aspects of society while seeking to preserve society's best. All this adds up to a lively debate and a needed one, which Dr. Robans escorts us through. Her work reminds us that some problems demand truly global solutions and truly global sacrifice if we are indeed to craft a shared legacy and a better world for all. So Professor Ingrid Robans holds a chair in ethics of institutions at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She was trained as an economist and philosopher and received her PhD from Cambridge University in 2003. Her dissertation was on gender inequality and the capability approach under the supervision of Amartya Sen. She has published widely in economic, social, and political ethics, especially on questions of social justice, the capability approach, and what policies and institutions we need for better societies, such relevant issues and topics. She served as the 8th president of the Human Development and Capability Association and is a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. She is currently working a book on limitarianism, which is the topic of today's lecture, written for a general readership. It's a forthcoming book by Astra House Publisher, and it will be published at the end of 2023. So we should look forward to receiving this new book. The title of her talk today is "In This World on Fire, What Can Limitarianism Bring Us?" Welcome, Professor Robans.
Thank you very much. I will try to, and thank you all for attending this talk. I'm really pleased to see so many people from what I presume are different places in the world. I will now do what I'm really bad in, which is to share my screen, but otherwise you can't see my PowerPoint. Okay, let me just advance. Oh, it worked. Yes, there it is. Okay, this one needs to go. If I don't hear any shouts from any of you, but it went, yeah, there it is in the beginning. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today is this thing called limitarianism. I know it's a horrible word, and I've actually been telling to my publishers, are you sure you want to put this on the cover? Because also some people who are opposed to egalitarian or progressive policies are making jokes that it sounds like militarianism, which is of course absolutely not the association that I want. But I will explain why I think we need a word that is different from egalitarianism in the course of this talk. And so basically, I will tell you what it is, and I will give you a range of arguments why I think we should endorse this, and then zoom in on one argument in particular, which is the ecological argument. There will first, however, be some data after I've presented you a kind of a working definition, which is that I think it's the view that there should be an upper limit to how much of a scarce and valuable resource each person can have. So that means that it could also be applied to other scarce and valuable resources, such as, for example, there was in South Africa, in Cape Town, at some point, there was not enough drinking water, not enough water. And then what one typically does in such a situation is rationing. Rationing is one form of limitarianism. But of course, I will focus on what I think is the most urgent version, which is limits to wealth and income. More colloquially, you could put the view in those words: no one should be extremely rich. Now, I know that there's lots of people in the world that think this is a view that's based on envy. However, I think this is a sort of a debate stopper. This has nothing to do with envy, but with arguments. If I were to hold this view and I cannot give you any good reasons why I hold this view, then the view is wrong or bad. But I think we actually have plenty of reasons to endorse this view, and that's what I want to present to you today. And I must first take you through some statistics, because the question is, what is extreme wealth? What if we talk about too much, then what are we talking about? Now, of course, the first place one might go looking for a question about an answer to what is too much is, of course, the billionaires in the world. Forbes has an interesting list of the world's billionaires. There are about slightly more than 2,000 people in the world now that count as a billionaire. However, I think there are a couple of comments to make about this list. One is, it does not include royals and heads of state. So Elon Musk, who is this year in the billionaires list on the first spot, has been on record for saying that actually he's not the richest man on earth, but that is Vladimir Putin. And then if you start to do some research on what is the wealth that Vladimir Putin owns, you can only find guesses. And the reason is, of course, that there is this whole network of kleptocrats, of heads of states that are using either the valuable raw resources in their country, which could be oil or diamonds, and use that to seize power or hold power, or basically, they become dictators, but they use the economic resources to consolidate their their political power. So those are not on this list, and they are an important answer to the question why extreme wealth concentration is a problem for all of us. And then the second, which I would think is a very obvious comment, is, well, it's fine to say $1 billion is too much, but I think that is a very weak statement, because $1 billion is way too much. I think that if we were to have something like a limit, a threshold, it should be much, much lower than $1 billion or €1 billion or pounds. Now, let us look at a couple of data figures, just to see how inequalities have changed over time. And this is just a selection of data. I've only present you data from the US and a couple of comparisons with Europe, but you can find there's by now a wealth of data on income and wealth inequalities. So the first one, which I think is quite striking and quite revealing, is the comparison between the ratio between what CEOs get and what workers get in companies. So there is a study that was published in 2019 on this ratio over time. And in as you can see from the data on the screen, in 1965, this ratio in those 350 firms was 20:1. So the CEO would earn 20 times as much as the average worker. In recent years, this is now around 275, or it fluctuates a little bit. It peaked in the year 2000 at 369. These figures are they're astronomical, and I think what is really important is for us is to try to visualize this, because I was actually trained as an economist, but even for me, these figures are quite difficult to grasp if you don't try to translate what it really means. So, for example, let us take the CEO to work compensation ratio of 275, which is now the one that we currently have. That means that if you take the annual compensation of a typical worker in a company, and you take the annual compensation of 275 workers together, you have the compensation of the CEO. So that is a very, very large compensation package. And as you can see from the second line on this slide, currently it's for $14 million. $14 million. I would just say translate this to how many houses you could buy with $14 million in the area in which you live, to make it concrete what these figures mean. Now, what do we know about inequality changes over time? Roughly, and I'm actually, what I think you should remember, if you don't know this, because I am also sure for many of you this will be an open door, is that around that we had a decrease of inequality after the Second World War up until the end of the 70s, and from the 1980s onwards, we have had an increase in inequality. So let me just talk you briefly through this slide, which is from the latest book by Thomas Piketty. The red lines, let us first look at the red lines, are data for the USA. This is the share of the richest 10% and the poorest 50% in national income. So how much of the national income do these two groups take home? And there you see that there was, for the US, the richest 10%, which is the highest line, the dotted line, that there was a high level of about between 43 and 50% up until the Second World War. And then, of course, there was the disruption caused by the war. And then it was decreasing somewhat in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It became sort of stabilized in the 70s up until the 80s, and then it has been increasing again. And we've seen basically, and so what happened with the poorest is that in the post-war years, so from 45 till the end of the, well, say the 70s, the end of the 70s, that their share increased somewhat. And then from 1980 onwards, it decreased again. That means that we had a period in both the US and in Europe where, after the Second World War, where inequalities were, thanks to fiscal policies, thanks to the way we designed taxation and some other public goods, were decreasing. But at the end of the 80s, when neoliberal policies became dominant, they widened again, and now they're back basically at where they were at the beginning of last century. And of course, what we also see is that the situation in Europe is somewhat less inegalitarian. So Europe always has had somewhat the inequalities in Europe have always been smaller than in the US, but we do see the same tendencies. There is one exception, which I will show to you in a second. And I should say, I mean, there are details that I will skip now for the sake of, because I want to get to the philosophical arguments, but, and none of the details affect what I say, but I just want to point that out for the sake of completion, that, for example, in this graph, Europe is not all the countries in Europe, but it's a representative sample. Now, what do we know about wealth? There's some interesting data from the Federal Reserve's distributional financial accounts. I give you here the data for first quarter of 2022. In the US, 50% of the population, so that's half of the people, own 2.8% of wealth. And their definition, the definition that the Fed uses of wealth is a very broad definition. It also includes durable consumption goods such as cars. Then you have a group in the middle, the next 40% has 28.4% of wealth. And what we see is that there is really a concentration of almost 70% of wealth is in the top 10%. And there it's, this is for anybody who's ever looked at those figures familiar, but we see that 9% of those 10% richest people, 9% has almost 37% of wealth. And then this 1% has the first 9 of those, that 1% has 31% of wealth, and the 0.1 top, which is 1 in 1,000 citizens, has 12.6% of wealth. So the inequality, and these types of inequalities are really extreme. And the way you can let this sink in, really understand it, is by there are people who've made visualizations of this. I don't know how to make them look really good. And I also think that the one that the Fed uses are also, I mean, you have to be somewhat trained in looking at statistics to see them. So what I would suggest is that we just imagine that imagine that the US consists of 1,000 people. So the whole population is 1,000 people, and together they produce, they make the what philosophers call the social product. Together they work together and they make wealth, they make prosperity together. How then do they divide this? Well, first comes one of those 1,000 persons. He will be a white person, I can predict. And of those, and imagine that the whole economic production is equivalent to 1,000, say, rice bags. You could also do it with cars or with houses or something else. Then that one person, which is the top 0.1%, will take 126 of those rice bags. If there was perfect equality of outcome, each person would take one rice bag. And now this person has 126 rice bags. The next 9 people will take 310 rice bags. And then the next 90 people will take 369 rice bags. Then comes a group of 400 people who together have 284 bags. And for the remaining 500 citizens, there are 28 bags left. So I think by making it more concrete, we can see how massive these inequalities are. And the reason why I'm stressing this is because inequalities are increasing. But even if inequalities were not increasing, they would be stable, they would still be unacceptably large. So often you hear people saying, yeah, there's really a problem because inequalities are increasing. But the real problem is the increasing is like adding insult to injury. The problem is that inequalities are so huge. And of course, I'm saying this now as a normative statement, but I will give you the arguments for why I believe this to be the case in the second half of this presentation. So here you can see how the inequalities changed since the beginning of the data set, which is 1989. So you see that the bottom 50% saw a decrease of their already very small wealth holding. Also, what you could see as the middle classes saw a decrease of their wealth holding, and then everybody in the top 10% saw an increase, especially the one in the 0.1 and 1%. This is a second slide, and I'm presenting this of Piketty. The reason I'm presenting this slide is because it also shows it shows again this basically the last 120 years, and it confirms the widely shared view in the literature on inequality that the 1980s were a pivotal year where inequality started to increase again. If you look at the red lines, these are data from the US, so let's focus on those. The top one is the share of the richest 10%. This is in private property. Piketty uses this word, but when I looked at this definition, it could be similar to how we use wealth. So it's not just housing, but it's also financial property. And there we see that in the beginning of the last century, so around 1900s until 1920, the richest 10% in the US had about 80% of the private property. Then already from the 1930s, it started to lower. It lowered until around 1950. And then it's lowered a bit further, but since 1980, it's again increasing. I think although you see the movement, I actually find the level much more disturbing than the trend, although the trend is still up. But the fact that still, and Piketty also writes about this, we really have an issue of extreme wealth concentration throughout the world. One thing that is interesting in this graph is that you see that if you look at the bottom, you see there the share that the poorest 50%, so that's half of the population, have in terms of private property in the US, the red line, and Europe, the blue line. And you see that essentially in the US, the bottom 50% has virtually no property. Very, very little property. In Europe, they still have very, very little property, but we do see an effect from around 1955. So we do see there a bit of an effect of the welfare state policies that were designed. And you also see that from the difference between the US and Europe, that the causes behind this, which is basically this form of capitalism that we have and the fiscal policies that we have, and there are some more things to do with the control of the richest over the democratic system, makes inequalities larger in Europe than in the US. Okay, I need to be mindful of time because I do want to get to the philosophical arguments, but I think I will still show this last one, which is taxes. And this really explains to a large degree why we have these inequalities. This shows you for different groups in society the effective tax rate. So all the different tax rates combined together as a percentage of their income. And we see that throughout from basically the 1930s all the way till the 1980s roughly, but it already started to decline much earlier. Basically the 90% least rich, which is the red triangles, paid significantly less or lower taxes than the richest 1%, 0.1, and so on. But if you look at to the right-hand side, basically the last 10 years, the differences are very, very small. Basically now all groups pay roughly the same effective tax rates, and it's even the case that because of some very recent ways in which the most rich people in the US have been able to create loopholes in the American fiscal system, they now pay even less than other groups. And I'm sure that there are, I mean, I can, if anybody wants to know more about this, I can send you some references, but there are American, not only scholars, but also activists who've written very interesting books on this, on how basically the class of super rich people have taken control over the political system and have changed wave by wave the fiscal system in such a way that they pay now less tax than other groups. Now, there is another thing to be aware of, and that is there's going to be a huge inheritance wave over the next decades. I don't have all the data on this ready, but I will just give you one figure because it just illustrates how massive this transfer will be. There has been a study that's looked at the inheritance that will be happening until 2045 among what they call high net worth, but we should call it high net wealth families, people who are defined as having at least 5 million in wealth. And there is an estimated transfer of $48 trillion between the time of the study and 2045. And just to compare that number, the current US GDP is about $20 trillion. So we're talking about US GDP, 4 times that amount of money will be transferred in the next 25 years among wealthy families. And if you just look at the figure, you see that the bottom, the dark blue part is what is expected to go to heirs. So most of the money goes to heirs. We do see a lot of newspaper pieces about charity and about philanthropy, but really most of it goes to children and other heirs. So basically what I did so far was just reporting on the research that other people have done, but it is important because it basically is it provides the factual background of why I'm asking this question. Why is this a problem? And why do I think we should care about the fact that some people have so much money? And why do I think we should try to find ways to put a cap on how much wealth people hold? Well, I will give you a number of reasons very briefly, and then I will focus on one in particular. And the reason is just that in the book I'm writing, I'm looking at all those reasons and further details, but I cannot present all of this today. So the first, and I think is very important reason, is that some of this money, some of the wealth, is actually tainted. It's built on deeply immoral processes such as slavery. So slavery is, I think, in the US context, very important. There's also a Dutch journalist has written a book about the remaining, the extent to which fortunes in German companies and wealthy families is still related to basically advantages that those families had under the Nazi regime. So of course, each country or each continent will have particular problems that are related to the histories that they've had. And I think for the US, slavery is a very important one. And I want to show you this from the Federal Reserve's data. This is a racial distribution of wealth in the US. The whole is 100%. And what we see is that white people in the US hold 83% of wealth, and Black people only hold 4.5% of wealth. And I've basically cut out the last 2 years to show you the magnitude of how inequalities are also racialized. But and if you look at all the data, you see that there is a slight improvement, but it is minuscule. Of course, we know that, and this actually is the case, not just in the US, but also in other countries, that when slaves were freed, when finally slavery became illegal, that the slave owners were compensated. So rather than compensated the slaves who had been not just mistreated, but also had been producing the wealth for the slave owners for so long, it's actually, ironically, the slave owners that were compensated. So I do think if there would now be a rectification of this historical injustice, it would have a significant effect on the racial composition of the distribution of wealth. And as far as I can see, this is justified on moral reasons, because the process that led to this current distribution is an unjust one. It may be that at the time this was the only thing that was considered politically feasible, but that doesn't make it morally acceptable. So here is a list of all the reasons I have why, well, it's actually not even complete, but the most important reasons I want to offer you why we should take limitarianism seriously and be worried about extreme wealth concentration. I will go through them briefly, and then I will focus on the one on ecological sustainability in some more detail. The first one I already said, some of the money is tainted. It's built on deeply immoral processes such as slavery. This means also that there may be currently young people in, not just in the US, actually also in Europe, who are benefiting from inheritances that are tainted in this way. And there are organizations both of young inheritors themselves, but also organizations that advise very rich people on how to deal with this. So it is not, so there are processes ongoing, but the big question is how many of the super rich people are actually taking this problem seriously. The second reason is, I think, the most, it's actually for me as a philosopher, I think this is the most fundamental, which is that none of us deserves in the moral sense the wealth that we that happens to come our way. It may be that, of course, you can say that some of it, of what you get, or of what you are able to earn, or what you're able to accumulate, can be related, of course, to aspects of choices you made that for which you should be given really due credit. So I also do not think, as some other philosophers do, that actually morality would require us to advocate equality of outcome. I do think that some inequalities can be justified, but not the inequalities that we currently see. So it is the case that much of our capacity in life to be economically successful, but even to just have a good life, are due to circumstances or to luck that have been beyond our own control. So what are the most important factors that determine our chances in life statistically seen? Where we are born, we didn't choose where we are born. When we were born, we didn't choose when we were born. Our parents, we didn't choose our parents. Our innate talents and our genes and our innate impairments, we didn't choose any of those. The people around us who taught us the attitudes to pick a goal in life and work towards that goal. So basically teachers, when we are young, we didn't choose our teachers. Of course, if you take this to the extreme, this view, you embrace determinism, radical determinism, where you say nothing what you did you can say that you really deserve. My position is that, and this is there's a variety of positions on this matter in philosophy. My position is that radical determinism goes too far, because I do think it would almost deny agency to the person if you cannot even, if we were to say that nothing what you do, you can say that you took ownership. I do think people have choices they can make. And so I do think that we should give recognition to good choices that people make, but we should also really acknowledge that if we are successful, that a really big chunk of that success is due to circumstances. And a very important source of circumstance of economic success is what previous generations created for us in terms of infrastructure, in terms of technology development, and so on. And so we have, for example, many scientists who developed vaccines or other types of technology or public goods that are available to all, that either they just shared with humanity. For example, the person who invented the polio vaccine just said, I'm not taking a patent, this is for all of humanity. But also that many of those technological developments have been funded by taxpayers, because science is often to a large extent funded by taxpayers. At least that was definitely the case in the centuries on the heydays of the welfare state, and it's still the case, but there are some cracks in that public good. So this is why I think the second reason why we should really question the idea of that we can say this is ours, we created it, so we deserve it, is because we should have a different view on what we can attribute to ourselves and what is attributable to others. So that's the second reason. The third reason is, and this is for the philosophers in the room, a classical utilitarian argument or consequentialist argument. Excess wealth concentration is actually wasteful. Why? Because if you have no money and you acquire a little bit of money, you can do a lot of good with it. You can meet basic needs. And the marginal utility of so basically what you can do with additional units of money decreases. So the more richer you become, the less you can use your money to really meet your needs or improve your quality of life. But what you can do is meet first luxury wants, expensive jewelry or very fancy luxury items. And of course, and this is what we know from some qualitative sociological research, it is about positional goods vis-a-vis other rich people who are even richer than you are. So for if when people assess their own wealth, what they do is they look up and they see especially what those who have more than them, what they have, then of course there's always a way in which you can use more money, because there is never a limit to it. And this is related to a literature in scholarship about positional goods. So basically that the value of a certain good that you have is dependent on the distribution of that good amongst others. So for example, things that would become status objects, such as the type of car you have, or whether you have second and third homes, or whether you have a private jet, or how big your yacht is, and all these questions only become relevant because you compare it with what somebody else has. Whereas basic necessities, such as food, if you're malnourished and you're hungry, it really doesn't matter what others have. It's really about the biophysical needs of your body. So this means that if we were to redistribute all this excess wealth to meet those urgent unmet needs, we would make life for a very large group of humans much better. And this argument has been made by many philosophers and also by activists. But it is, of course, an argument that appeals to a moral position and that is you have to endorse a particular philosophical view before this argument works. So let me go to the fourth argument, the fourth reason for limitarianism. And this is a very important one. And unfortunately, I will have to be brief because otherwise I cannot say anything in more depth about ecological sustainability. But it is especially in the US context, a very important one. And that is that wealth concentration undermines democratic values. So yes, I don't know how much more I should say about this for anybody who's been reading independent news sources. But you could, in principle, so the way this works is by, say, sponsoring candidates who run for election, so making donations, but also lobbying. If you are able to pay for a lobbyist, they can defend your interests. You can also set up interest groups or think tanks, which have been very important in the spread of neoliberal thinking. And you can buy media. And it's interesting that we increasingly see super rich people do this. Because if you control media, you control an important source of the communication that we need in democratic societies. There is a counter argument. So the argument then would be, if you're able to limit wealth, people can no longer use that excess wealth to spend on undermining political equality, and hence having a society with no wealth concentration, even if you have some acceptable level of inequality, would protect democracies. I think that is true, but the counter argument that I sometimes hear is, but why would you take wealth from people? Because you can just say that you cannot use it for undermining political equality. And that is why I mentioned that I think this problem is more severe in the US than in at least most European countries. And that is that the European Union actually has a set of legislation that makes it illegal to, for example, do any donations without registering them and so on. So what this legislation has tried to do is to build a wall between the political sphere of life and the economic sphere of life. And that is, of course, the first thing you should do, because then you try to protect the principle of one person, one vote. However, the problem is that if there are powers that try to undermine democracy, and we do have those powers in Europe too, in the form of some, we'll have to use the word, but some fascist type of political parties, that they basically, they would laugh at this kind of argument, because they say, well, you can advocate what you want, but I'm just going to do whatever I want and make sure that it doesn't see the light of day. So they will do stuff illegally, and in that way still their wealth can undermine democratic processes. And this means that the value of protecting democracies, I think there is an important connection with wealth, but this requires much more. This requires healthy free press. It requires strong institutions. It requires independent judges who are able to really protect democracy. So the question, what does democracy require, is a very crucially important question, and wealth will play one role in this. Okay, I see that I'm actually running out of time, so this is super dramatic for my presentation, but I will not say anything about 6. There is an argument, I think this is a weak argument, but the evidence supports it, that actually being super rich doesn't make the super rich happy themselves. So if they would only see this, they would agree with a world in which there wouldn't be a class of super rich people. I want to say something brief in the last 7 to 8 minutes about the relationship between extreme wealth concentration and ecological sustainability, especially climate change. So there are 5 reasons why ecological sustainability prompts us to put limits on wealth. The first one is that much of wealth that has been generated has been based on ecological destruction, and that those profits, which would be much smaller if that wealth creation had met ecological duties. So, for example, we often use in climate science and climate ethics 1990 as the date, because that's the year when the first IPCC report was published, when no government or no person in a leading function could say that they didn't know the relationship between emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, and climate change and all the negative destructive effects of climate change. However, the fossil fuel industry has still been emitting massively and making massive profits. If they had paid what economists called the negative externality, hence for the harm that they do because of the negative effects of their polluting activities, their wealth and their profits and hence their wealth would be much smaller. So it is actually a version of the argument that at least part of that wealth is also based on an illegitimate mode of acquisition. The second argument is that much of the progress on climate action there's a typo on this slide. It's much of the progress is actually obstructed by the fossil fuel industry. Much of the lack of progress in climate action comes from the obstruction from the fossil fuel industry and others who profit from fossil capitalism. And those people tend to be part of the class of the super rich. So climate scientists, especially people who work in, say, governance studies or political science and who study climate action, many of them, and an increasing number of them, argue that the obstruction from the fossil industry is really the biggest problem that we have. It's not even so much what is the per capita emissions, to which I will turn in a second, but really the fact that there is this big power struggle, and the fossil industry, which I define broadly, not just those who sell coal and oil and gas, but also those who make profits based on derivatives. They really want to sell whatever they have, and they are already allowed to take out of to dig up, basically. I think if we were to tax away extreme wealth, we would weaken the destructive political influence that the super rich can have on climate action. I think this will not be enough. Actually, I have a scholarly paper with Fergus Green, where we argue that what this problem actually might need is nationalizing the fossil fuel industry. Because once you nationalize it, you can no longer allow the fossil fuel industry to try to take the decisions that the governments would like to take. But I should say that this proposal is also prone to some real life problems about the fact that many governments actually are in themselves not doing what they should do, which is to defend the interest of all citizens. So you also see that here's an example of how the problems of ecological unsustainability and the problems of having a strong democracy and having this excess wealth, they're all intertangled. And one of the things I would like to do with the book that I'm writing is to show that we might need really radical measures to, because all these problems are so intertangled. The third and the fourth reason have to do with the emissions of different groups. In a nutshell, rich people in the world emit much more than those who are not rich. And this holds both for individuals, but also for countries. In this table, it's a bit old data. It's the first paper that Piketty and Lucas Chancel wrote on this. But basically the size of the numbers is still roughly the same, although the numbers are luckily going down a little bit, except for China, which goes up. You can see that the first column gives you the emissions, the tons emissions per person per year, which are consumption based. So on average in the world, we emit about 6 tons CO2. The E stands for equivalent. So the other greenhouse gas emissions are recalculated on a basis with CO2. And then you just see what I think anybody who looks at the data sees, which is that North America emits way more than any other continent. Actually, Australia, which is not on this list, is also very high up. Western Europe also emits a lot. And then you have the upcoming economies like China that actually is increasing its emission. The Middle East is in that region. But then you have these huge continents, basically Asia and except for China and Africa, that have very low emissions. But they are the ones, the people who live in those countries, in those regions, in those continents, are the ones that actually we shouldn't talk in the future tense. They are already suffering from the effects of climate change that are caused by, especially historically, Europe and North America and Australia. So we have a problem internationally between rich and poor countries, if I can just put it as bluntly as that, but also between individuals. So you also have very rich individuals in those countries that are emitting much more. So what follows? I think we should have something like climate reparations, because the rich have known for decades that they're harming the common planet and they need to compensate for the harm done. I know from colleagues who work only on climate science and climate governance that this is seen as politically unfeasible. But I do think that if I look at this from moral philosophy, that the countries, the developing countries who are demanding not only massive transfer of clean technology, but also climate reparations, that their demands are justified. And we also need something of reparations between individuals. So all those very rich people who have for decades emitted way too much should repair the damage done. And that's 4. The question is, should we make hyper-polluting lifestyles impossible? I mean, I will skip the argument here, but I would just like to say that there are different ways in which one could do this. But it is an easy way that if we just didn't have extremely rich people, they also can't have those hyper-polluting consumption patterns, such as private jets and yachts and houses with many, many rooms and private heated pools and so on. Of course, some of this could possibly be you could by electrifying, you could move to a CO2 neutral way of consumption, but that's not the case for private jets and for yachts, not yet. And also, of course, not for other types of luxury consumption. But I'll skip this because I really need to wrap up. And I think a very important argument, ecological argument for limitarianism is basically, we are in an emergency situation regarding climate change, and then different principles apply. It's basically just like when you have normal principles, for example, about protection of property. If there's a war, you have a different set of principles. And I think we are, as a human species, we are in such an emergency situation. So even if all the other 4 reasons I mentioned were not relevant or applicable, then I still think we can say we have a collective action problem. We are not going to solve this by waiting for billionaires who are trying to build new technologies, as Bill Gates has proposed in his book. What we should have is governments coordinating efforts to roll out and the plans that scientists have proposed to have deep carbonization based on the technology that exists. And for example, the work by Mariana Mazzucato, the economist, in her book Moonshot Economy, makes it also clear that you could, as a government, just say, this is what we should do. So you turn it into a mission for the entire society, which I think should be a mission for all the countries that can currently afford it. The thing is, there is money to do this. So so this is the paradox, that we have somebody like Elon Musk rolling out, or actually other billionaires too, rolling out space tourism. But we have this planet. This planet should be saved for all, and the money is there. We should just understand that actually they don't deserve it, and that even if they were to deserve it, we are in an emergency situation. We should tax it, and it would be a better world for all of us if we could save this planet. My time is up, but I will, what I will say is this, just to wrap up. Limitarianism will not solve the climate crisis. For the climate crisis, we need many other things. We also need the middle classes will need to be able to make changes. They will need to make choices to make those changes, but they will also have to be supported and nudged to make those changes. It's not just the super rich. But I do think that limitarianism, hence just saying enough is enough, can be one element of a new socioeconomic order that we need. And we have to start to do that in powerful societies. So behind this project is the bigger question also about what kind of economic system do we need? And it's clear that the current form of capitalism that we have in the first place in North America, but also to a large degree in Europe and spreading through the world, that this is benefiting. I mean, I'm now using the title of a book. It's benefiting just the 1%, and it should be benefiting not just a few, but all of us. And I will close on this last comment, which is the reason I think it may be helpful to talk about limitarianism rather than egalitarianism is, although I am myself also some form of egalitarian, I think limitarianism still allows for some inequalities. So it will be able to get a broader coalition of both moral and political views to agree on a common ground, even if they disagree about to what extent they want to reduce remaining inequalities. Thank you.
Thank you so much. What an excellent, insightful presentation. You have given us so much to think about. And I think this whole notion of limitarianism that you have, this word actually makes sense as you describe the issues today. You just mentioned capitalism and the form of capitalism that we have now. And I know this was not originally what capitalism was meant to be, you know, when it was first constructed. Do you have any thoughts about what aspects of capitalism could shape a better future, and any views about that? I mean, what can we get rid of and what can we keep, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah. Yes, that's a very good question. I should say that my answer will be tentative because this is actually what I want to do. It's a really big question, and I will give you a tentative answer. So I may change my mind on details, but one can even question whether what we currently have is capitalism, because it really seems to be. So it depends on how you define capitalism. And what you see in the literature is that people often they reject capitalism, but they don't say how they define it, how they understand it. And if capitalism means what some people, especially who defend it, believe, namely free markets, some markets, to have them free is a good thing. Some markets, consumption good markets. So I think we should be glad that, well, at least I believe we should be glad that there is not a dictatorial government deciding which shoes we can wear or where we can work. But that is a limited set of markets. So that aspect of capitalism and also the freedoms it brings are good. So for example, also if you compare it with bonded labor, capitalism is definitely, that aspect of capitalism is better. But the problem is that there are many problems with the current form of economic system or capitalism that we have. And I think the one that I'm stressing here is that it's basically you produce together with all the people economic welfare, wealth, and then in that process you divide it up, and basically those who have already most take the biggest share. So there is a big distributional issue. And the other point is that what neoliberalism, as this forum has also brought us, is that so some political economists or sociologists say that the essence of capitalist is that those who hold capital, so the capitalists, they will always seek for places to have a return on their capital and hence have new investment opportunities. And what neoliberalism has done, that economic system, is to transfer a lot of things that were actually under the regulation of the people, of the government, to the private sphere. So, for example, at least that is what happened in Europe, but I assume also in the US. So, for example, education can become privatized, healthcare can become privatized, or, for example, in my country, we have privatized kindergarten. So basically childcare for small children. And there are just pure investors who have nothing to do with caring for babies who own those businesses. And then, of course, what they do is they are driven by seeking profits. And there is in certain services in the economy or certain production of goods, but especially the things that were traditionally under the welfare state, there is a clash between the profit motive and producing a good service. And that's where I think this is one of the areas where capitalism has gone into an area where it should stay out, in addition to the big problem about power and the distributional effects. So, but I think the question is, should we really replace capitalism with a totally different system, or is it possible to rescue capitalism? And that's where I'm not yet sure.
Yeah, no, that is a very good question. Okay, I'm going to turn the time over to Kate, who is going to conduct the Q&A.
Thank you. So the first audience question is just a comment to say thank you for a fantastic lecture. So that was a nice and easy one. The second one is from Malik Wilson, and his question is, what is the longer view? Except for agrarian societies and hunter-gatherer societies, hasn't the material and social line between rich and poor flattened out more in the last 200 years than any time in human history? Now that we've exited the age of great kings, don't we risk pressing replay only under the guise of vast, all-knowing, all-wise, and increasingly powerful bureaucracies? Isn't the previous century, and Europe in particular, littered with the stale ghosts of we know best central planning?
So Europe, Europe, of course, in the last century was divided. So you had the countries in the East that had central planning. I also think, so there are some positive aspects to the quality of life of people there, but also, of course, they were these were all effectively dictatorships. So that is a big reason not to want them. But also they were, there was much less innovation. So this is also one of the, so I think that there is a characteristic of capitalism that is positively related to innovation, but it doesn't require excess money. So I think what we should really have is a balance of power between different, let us call them agents in the economic system. So we have the government, which should have some power, but not too much, and should also have power over certain areas. You should have a functioning democracy so that the citizens basically can decide what the government is going to regulate about the economy. Then you should have private citizens and companies doing business. And then also something that we seem to have lost is the commons. So historically, we had citizens providing on a non-profit basis for each other outside profit-seeking organizations. So I think if we were to diversify and really think through what kind of provisioning do we need, can we allocate to these different agents, we may have a system that is also more robust because nobody has all the power. And the person who asked the question is right that you don't want, but I agree that we don't want, or I agree with those who think we shouldn't want central planning because then the government has all the power. But I also don't think we should have the current system whereby actually our officially democratically elected officials are actually increasingly serving the 1%. So basically the 1% rule, not just the economy, but also politics.
Thank you. The next question comes from Sam Pizzagatti. 2 US cities, Portland and San Francisco, have imposed higher tax rates on corporations that pay their top executives over 100 times their average worker compensation. Similar federal legislation is pending. Do you see penalizing corporations with wide pay differentials as a promising step forward?
Yes, I'm saying hi to Sam Pizzagatti because I have his book lying next to my bed. So it's one of the things I will be reading over the next weeks, and I'm glad to connect here. So he's been one of those people who, so I should say to those of you interested in this topic, there's a huge literature out there on all sorts of actual relevant things, and Sam Pizzagatti has written a book on having a maximum income. So yeah, so so I do think this could, I cannot really say whether this is in this case what would work, because it depends on a lot of practical details. But the way I think about this is as follows. So the problem is, of course, first you want to know, do we have good reasons to want to impose a certain policy or institutional change? So yes, we agree here, yes, we should have this. And then is a question, what can we do? What is feasible? And this, in this case, I do not know, for example, if you were to do this, whether those companies would go to the next state. If they do that, then you have a problem. But that is not, even if they do that, it's not the end of the discussion, because then what we should do is to work on those feasibility constraints. So for example, that's often an argument in international tax mobility, that you can't impose. So one of the big problems, it's actually surprising that I didn't say this explicitly in my talk, but one of the big problems is, of course, that capital is taxed much lower than income from labor. And an argument that's often given why we can't increase the tax rates on capital gains is that capital is mobile and then it will go internationally. But you could, of course, first try to address that feasibility constraint. And there are people who've written entire books, detailed proposals of how to, for example, one book is called Catching Capital, or you have a book by 2 Berkeley economists who try to propose how you could change those economic structures and those legal systems such that that feasibility constraint then is no longer applicable. And I do think there's also something about leadership. So I do think, because the US is one of the richest countries on earth, I still think the most powerful countries on earth, if the US were to take certain measures and call upon European countries and then also other countries to follow, that might work. So there are, for example, countries that have joined forces to say, we will no longer sell any licenses to take fossil, not just fuels, but fossil fuels from our territories. So they basically say, we unilaterally say we will no longer do this. And they're basically they're making a sort of a moral appeal to other countries to follow the lead. And that could also be a strategy.
Thank you. So the next question comes from Wanjiku Kagira Kagbo. Thank you for articulating so clearly the issues of inequalities. The wealthy would have an extremely hard time letting go of the grip and letting go of wealth. What role can the poor do to demand their share of what is rightfully theirs?
This is a very good question. So it depends, I guess, a bit also on the context, but there are social movements that are addressing so because the other side, of course, of this coin is what do the workers get? So of course, if I talked about this economic wealth that we create together, all of us, and then those who have already a lot take the biggest part or take a disproportionately big part. And of course, what those who have less could do is to organize, to basically create more power to be able to demand a larger share. This would mean in many places unionizing. I know that this is, because we've seen it with Amazon and other places, that this is really requires almost the willingness to, it requires really the willingness to take big risks, because people who try to unionize run serious risks. But there are, of course, also organizations, social movements that try to support those who do so. So I'm thinking of things like unions, but also, of course, joining grassroots democratic systems. I know that some American colleagues of mine are less optimistic about this, but I think the fact that somebody like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected based on just small donations by citizens is encouraging, because it is an example that it is possible to be elected in US federal politics without big money. But of course, she needs supporters, and there are many more political candidates like this that need support. So there are, and then my own view is always different types of political activism, very broadly defined, suit different types of people. So you should find something that suits what you would like to do.
Thank you. The next question comes from Vincent Spencer. Huey Long proposed a wealth redistribution plan in 1933 that addressed many social ills, with perhaps the obvious exception of climate change. Some of his ideas were incorporated into the New Deal programs, but wealth redistribution has never been implemented. Why have efforts like this failed in the past? And will climate change be enough of a universal concern to finally get the majority behind the idea of limiting excess wealth?
Yes. So can I first ask, thank you, Vincent Spencer, for this really interesting question. I should say it rings vaguely a bell, but I do not know this proposal by Huey Long. So I will Google it, but if you if you think it's hard to find, then I would really appreciate if you would send me an email with some more information. So the question is, are we at a point in history where we might be able to basically bring back more, let's just call it progressive politics? I mean, I just think, so this is very difficult to answer, because I always find it really difficult to predict what will happen. But I was surprised when I started. So the book I'm writing is not an academic book, it's a book for citizens. So I'm also not just reading academic work, but I'm reading work by activists, journalists, and I'm also reaching out to them and talking to them. And there's a lot of people working on this. There's really a lot of organizations, a lot of people who have written books, who also actually rich people themselves, who are just saying this is too much. I mean, the patriotic millionaires is a good example. So the question, but of course, so far we are not yet at the turning point, because if you look at everything I've seen from the countries that I follow, there's not yet a turning point. I haven't seen any country where, for example, actually with the news from the UK from yesterday, that the plan they had to increase taxation on profits, that was under the Prime Minister Truss, she wanted to abolish this increase, and it's now being reversed again. That may be a slight positive sign, but of course, what this Prime Minister proposed was really neoliberalism squared. She believed in things like, or she believes still in things like trickling down economics, which really is empirically proven not to work. So, but you know, I just think I think giving up is not an option, because, and that's why I always take so much time to talk about the data, because the data just make it so clear that this is such a huge inequality. And remember that there's now going to be a generation that actually did nothing. They even didn't work to earn those fortunes. They just were lucky in the family where they were born, and they will be given hundreds of millions just because they happen to be born with those parents. So one of the proposals I'm also making in the book is to have a cap on inheritance, pretty low cap, and to take that money and completely return it to citizens, to young citizens. So that would not just bring the top down, but also finally give those who are at the bottom 50% some sort of ownership, some sort of wealth. And it's been proposed by, or a variant of it has been proposed by several people, including Tony Atkinson, who was a fantastic economist from UK, but also Thomas Piketty. So I do think if enough people from different angles and different positions keep repeating those proposals, perhaps, and then you combine these arguments with activism and with politics, perhaps something will change. I hope so.
I hope so too. The next question comes from Julie Goredian. What do you think the role of a prophetic pragmatism is in this kind of problem solving? I am thinking of the work of Cornel West and the argument for recognizing the role of the wretched of the earth in transformation of world order. Thank you for your presentation.
Yes, so that's a very good question. How I understand it, it's also related to the previous question. So I'm kind of, I really think we should have coalitions for social change across classes. I also think we should, although I was not trained to talk about classes, because my first training was in just in mainstream economics, in which there are no classes because there's no power in that discipline. I mean, there is no thinking about power in that discipline. I do think we should really start again to talk about classes. And what's interesting is that some of the patriotic millionaires, for example, somebody like Abigail Disney, calls herself a class traitor. And I do think it's good to, we should just talk about this all the time. And of course, if those who are really the most oppressed were to rise, of course, some of them do, but rise more powerfully than they do now. So some people call this the pitchfork argument. That might make a change. But the question is how the power balance is between those who really will try to suppress that kind of rise and the strength that the most oppressed have. So I do think that's where I think it's so important to have coalitions across classes, across races, across continents. There is one positive thing to report here, and that is that some of these, there is a movement in philanthropy, which is, I think, a very problematic thing, but there is a movement to go for, they use different words, but to really focus on social justice and to give large sums of money to grassroots movements who are in some way representing disadvantaged or oppressed people, no strings attached, to let them decide themselves how they want to use it. And I mean, from what I read, but I may have to dig deeper, somebody like Mackenzie Scott is also doing this. So I think that is interesting, that because then basically you can't so basically what you then do as a very wealthy person is you acknowledge two things. You acknowledge exactly as in this question is asked, you acknowledge that there is a role for the rest of the earth to bring this new order. And you also acknowledge that you as a rich person are not to decide basically where the money should be used, because we also have very rich people who've given away most of their money, but then they gave it, for example, to universities. And of course, we are here in a university, but we are not the people who need the money most. So I think philanthropists should not give their money to universities or to football stadiums or to anything like this. They should indeed give it to the social movements.
Thank you. And that actually falls on to the next question from Wanjiku. Where does the exploitation of the poor countries fall in the equation of solving the inequalities?
Yes, that is a hugely important question, because I do think when I talked about illegitimately acquired wealth, then of course colonialism and ongoing international extractive practices are part of what is illegitimate. So I mean, I just think that much of the wealth in both, much, I don't know whether I should say much in the sense that much suggests more than half, but at least a sizable part of the wealth in Europe and North America and Australia is based on both practices that are not just exploitative, but also extremely violent regarding poor countries. So that requires some form of reparation, also regarding with this aspect of climate change. But there is an additional thing, because there is a really resistance among a significant size of populations in the US and Europe to make this argument, because they say it's about blaming the white people for history, and people really basically do not want to hear this about colonial histories. But there is an additional argument which I think is at least as troubling, which is we currently also produce a lot by collaborating between capitalists in one country and workers in another country. And there, this fundamental question about you produce something together and how are you going to divide up the profits of what you make is also not asked, because economists say, well, if they say, and they maybe have the statistics at their side, they say, well, capitalism really has solved a lot of extreme poverty in the world. If you look at the statistics, that's true. But first of all, that threshold of extreme poverty is extremely low. It's the purchasing power equivalent of $2 a day. So it would mean, what could you do with $2 a day in the US? That's where they draw the line. So that is already inhumanely low. But also there's still the question, why do we think that if, for example, we have a company such as H&M, I don't know how, yeah. So I think they're Swedish. The owners of that company, the heirs, are also in the Forbes list of billionaires. But why can they just say, okay, we let clothes be produced in the global south? Actually, people have a job there. They no longer starve. It's good for them. It's good for us. So hallelujah, we're all happy. No, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story should be, just like we asked this question within a country, how do you divide up the profits? How do you divide up what you produce together? And to see that that is a fundamental, so basically to see that you cannot take the distributional question out of economic questions. That, I think, if we could convince those who are thinking about economic decisions about that you cannot think about economics without thinking about the distributional aspects, that I think would be the biggest gain. Whereas now they only think about efficiency.
Thank you. I think we have time for the last question, which is from Tiffany Razavi. Thank you for an excellent and thought-provoking presentation. So much to think about. I would love to hear more about the connection between the capabilities approach and limitarianism.
Okay, yes. So I get, yeah, this is, okay, the academic answer to that question is, if you look at the paper I wrote in 2017, which is open access online, the way I put the richest line, I theorize it, actually starts from an idea of quality of life that is based on capabilities. So that's the academic answer. If I look at the more societal answer, in the end, I think, so the capability approach, for those of you who've never heard of this, is about human development. It's about giving people freedoms to live valuable lives. And I just think the argument that I gave about that the current distribution is wasteful, that just means there are many people who currently do not have their capabilities met. They are suffering in some way. They are hungry, or they are not schooled, or they have mental health problems, or whatever, all sorts of serious capability deprivations. Whereas once you have a certain amount of money, you can use it for status goods, but you cannot increase your capabilities. The only thing you buy is those goods that basically make it possible for you to compare yourself with the persons who are higher up, but they don't enlarge your capabilities. So that, I think, is the most important connection.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back over to Professor Mahmoudi now to close this out.
Thank you so much again. What a wonderful session with you, Dr. Robans. And we can't wait for you to finish your book so we can read it. I'm sure it will be a huge contribution to this important topic. And I'm so glad that you're writing it not just for an academic audience, so that it will have a long and far reach. But so thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and thank you all of you whom I cannot see. Thank you for coming and listening. Thank you.
So I just want to remind our viewers that our next event is on October 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, a very interesting event, which I highly recommend. We are co-sponsoring with the Phillips Collection, which is a private museum in Washington, D.C. The Phillips Collection has a series called Artists of Conscience. And our event, which is a virtual screening of a film that's called The Bomb, features the multimedia artist and filmmaker Smriti Kashari. And The Bomb explores the immense power of nuclear weapons, the perverse appeal they have, and the profound death wish at the very heart of them. It's a very interesting film, and Ms. Kashari will then entertain questions after we have viewed her film, and I highly recommend this event to all of you, especially at a time where there is now so much talk about nuclear weapons in our world. So again, the date is October 26, 2022, and it is at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Please make sure that you register for it. You can, of course, register on the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace website. And if you are signed up on our listserv, you will receive announcements about this. I thank all of you for being with us today. And again, my thanks to Professor Robans for her excellent presentation. Hope to see you all on October 26th. Thank you again. Bye-bye.